Have you ever been judged before you even said a word? Imagine walking onto a plane, calm, polite, accomplished, yet being told you don't belong in the seat you paid for, simply because of how you look. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Julian Hayes, a black CEO who boarded his own company's jet, only to be denied his first-class seat by the very people who worked for him. 12 minutes later, the world would witness a moment that redefined what true power and dignity look like. But here's the question. What would you have done? Would you have fought back with anger or with grace? Would you have demanded respect or quietly shown the world what leadership really means? This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about choice. About a man who could have broken down a system with rage, but chose instead to rebuild it with compassion. Because sometimes the loudest justice is delivered in silence. So, if you believe respect should never depend on appearance, stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe, and let's take this flight together. The fluorescent lights at Denver International Airport hummed quietly above the crowded terminal. It was 7:45 a.m., the kind of morning where everyone seemed to be rushing, yet going nowhere at all. Dr. Julian Hayes moved with a measured calm through the busy concourse, one hand holding a leather notebook, the other carrying a worn canvas briefcase. He looked like any mid-level consultant, not the billionaire CEO who had quietly built one of the most influential tech and aviation companies in America. And that was exactly what he wanted. He'd scheduled this flight without alerting his staff. No press, no assistants, no VIP greeting. Today, Julian was traveling as Mr. J. Hayes, a late-booked passenger on a Zenith Aviation charter, a company he himself owned. This was not a coincidence. It was a test. Zenith Aviation had grown fast since his acquisition 2 years earlier, offering private and semi-private luxury flights for executives and dignitaries. But in the last few months, Julian had received troubling whispers of certain crew members treating passengers differently. He didn't want numbers or memos. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He wore a simple gray button-down and dark slacks. His watch was plain, his shoes scuffed. To anyone watching, he could have been a man traveling on points, maybe visiting family out of town. He preferred it that way. At Gate C-12, the crowd was thinning. Only a handful of passengers remained, each radiating the subtle air of those used to being first, not waiting. Julian stepped forward, boarding pass in hand. The boarding agent scanned it, smiled politely, and waved him through. Then came the voice, sharp, precise, and utterly dismissive. "Sir, step back. First class isn't for people like you." Julian stopped mid-step. The words hung in the air like a slap. The speaker, Captain Sarah Mitchell, didn't even look directly at him. She was mid-40s, her blonde hair tied in a tight bun, her uniform pressed to perfection. She flicked her hand toward the rear cabin, as if swatting away an inconvenience. "Excuse me," Julian asked softly, his tone neutral. "You'll need to verify your priority status," Sarah said without turning her head. "First-class passengers have already been cleared. You might want to check with the back. They may have space in economy." A few nearby travelers looked up, curious. One of them, a man in a tailored navy suit and a gold watch the size of a biscuit, leaned over his briefcase and muttered, "Let's keep this area clear." "Okay." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of entitlement and a clear assumption. "You don't belong here." Julian held the boarding pass out again, calm and steady. "It's already been scanned," he said. Sarah barely glanced at the document. She took it between 2 fingers as though it might stain her gloves. "Unverified," she said, and pressed it back into his chest. Security will be notified if you don't return to your assigned section." He didn't move. For a long, silent moment, he simply looked at her, not in anger, but in quiet study. The polished floor reflected her shoes, the gleam of her captain's badge, the line of people watching now but saying nothing. Julian remembered a different reflection, his father's face in a diner window 40 years ago, when a waitress refused to serve them. He'd been 9. His father had simply said, "Dignity isn't something they can take, son, only something you can hand over." Julian lowered his hand and stepped aside, giving Sarah the illusion of victory. "Of course," he said evenly. "Take all the time you need." A murmur drifted through the gate. Someone whispered, "Did you hear what she said?" Another voice answered, "He probably didn't belong there anyway." From a few seats away, a young man, early 30s, Asian American, phone in hand, tilted his camera subtly. He'd seen scenes like this before, too many times. His name was Liam Chen, a travel blogger who'd made a career documenting human stories behind luxury travel. He knew exactly what he was witnessing. Julian stood near the boarding line, posture relaxed but eyes steady. He was not humiliated. He was gathering data. Every word, every gesture was a note in the report he was building silently in his mind. "Mr. Hayes," the boarding agent called from behind the counter, her voice hesitant. "Your seat's confirmed, sir." "One nay." Sarah turned sharply, irritation flashing across her face. "Excuse me," the agent hesitated. "It's confirmed." The system, Sarah cut her off with a tight smile. "Must be an error. Run it again." Julian's expression didn't change. He could have spoken then, could have ended the entire scene with a single sentence, "I own this company." But he didn't. Instead, he offered a quiet smile and said, "I'll wait." He stepped back, leaned against a nearby pillar, and opened his leather notebook. The pen glided smoothly across the page. Observation number 1. Prejudice doesn't need volume. It only needs comfort. Outside the window, the morning sun burned low over the Rocky Mountains, casting long stripes of light across the tarmac. A plane engine roared to life somewhere down the runway. Julian looked at the horizon for a moment, then closed his notebook. His calm wasn't apathy, it was control, the kind of strength that grows in men who've had to wait for the world to learn its lesson. He checked his watch. 7:56 a.m. 12 minutes until boarding closed. By then, he already knew those 12 minutes would change everything. The boarding area grew quieter after most passengers had gone inside. Only a handful remained those who thought time revolved around their schedules. The metallic hum of airport vents filled the silence that followed the awkward confrontation. Julian stood near the tall glass window overlooking the runway. Outside, the sky had softened into a pale gray, the kind that promised snow even when it was still October. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass-calm eyes. Steady breath, an expression that betrayed nothing. "Mrs." Collins sat 2 seats away, hands folded tightly over her purse. She glanced at him once, then away, then back again. It was the kind of look people gave when they wanted to apologize for someone else's rudeness but didn't know how. "I'm sorry about what happened, sir," she finally said, her voice soft, polite. "People can be thoughtless sometimes." Julian smiled kindly. "You don't owe me an apology, ma'am." She nodded, embarrassed. "I suppose not. Still, it was wrong." He looked at her, grateful for the effort. "It's all right," he said, and meant it, but deep down, a quiet ache had started to grow, not for himself, but for the pattern that never seemed to fade. When Mrs. Collins turned away. Julian opened his notebook again. The pen hovered over the page. He wrote slowly, deliberately. Observation number 2. Silence is not neutral. It takes sides the moment it looks away. His mind drifted, uninvited, to a memory buried deep in time. He was 9 again, sitting in his father's pickup on a humid Georgia afternoon. His father, Harold Hayes, had just been turned away from a restaurant for wearing work clothes. Julian remembered the sting of the moment, the way his father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Don't be angry, son," Harold had said, voice low and steady. "People see what they've been taught to see, but that doesn't mean we let them decide who we are." Julian had nodded back then, too young to fully understand. It wasn't until years later, when he saw the same look in other eyes, that he realized his father's calm wasn't weakness. It was discipline. The boarding agent called out, "Final boarding for Flight 982. Julian closed the notebook. He gave Mrs. Collins a polite nod, then approached the counter. The young woman behind it, cheeks flushed from tension, smiled nervously. "Sir, your seat is ready. I'm sorry again for the delay. No harm done," he said. "I appreciate your professionalism." As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool, recycled air hit his face. The carpet underfoot carried the faint smell of jet fuel and coffee. He moved slowly, his briefcase in one hand, his mind cataloging every detail, the clipped
We
tone
understand the
of
gravity
Captain
of the
Mitchell
situation,
earlier,
but the
the
allegations
avoidance
against
in the other
Zenith do not
passenger's
reflect the
eyes,
values of this
the way the
company
system
or
had
its
hesitated
employees.
when it saw his name inside the cabin. The lighting was warm and muted. Rows of wide leather seats gleamed like polished bronze. The few passengers already seated turned to glance up. Richard Holt was among them, his gold watch catching the light. His lips curled slightly. Julian nodded politely and placed his bag in the overhead compartment. He took seat 1A. A minute later, Captain Mitchell entered the cabin, speaking quietly with her first officer, Tom Blake. Her jaw tightened when she saw Julian sitting in the front row. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice measured but firm. "This area is restricted to verified passengers." Julian met her gaze evenly. "Your agent confirmed my seat." 1A. Sarah hesitated, her professional smile flickering. "There seems to be an issue with the manifest. I'll have it sorted before takeoff." He gave a slight nod. "Take your time,
Welcome
Captain."
to the Zenith Foundation.
Her
We
eyes
believe in
narrowed just a
elevating the
fraction,
next
but
generation
enough
of
for him
leaders,
to see
and
it,
that
the
starts with
discomfort of
every
authority
single one of you
challenged
in
by
this room
composure.
today.
She turned briskly and walked toward the cockpit, across the aisle. Liam Chen lowered his phone slightly. He hadn't started recording again, but his thumb hovered near the button. Something about this man, this quiet, dignified stranger, had caught his attention. Julian leaned back. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the faint scent of disinfectant and leather. The engines whirred somewhere beneath the cabin floor. His thoughts wandered again, this time to his company, the thousands of employees who carried his name on their paychecks. He had built Zenith from a small software firm into a global powerhouse. But he'd learned something along the way. Success didn't insulate anyone from ignorance. It simply revealed who chose to rise above it. He thought of the diversity training programs, the internal code of conduct he'd personally reviewed, the countless memos reminding staff of equal treatment and respect. Yet here he was, being told to prove he belonged in a seat on his own plane. There was an irony to it so sharp it almost made him laugh. Tom Blake, the first officer, passed through the cabin, pausing near his seat. "Sir," he said curtly, "we'll need to check your credentials once more before takeoff." Julian opened his eyes. "Of course," he said. "I'll be right here." The young man shifted uneasily, then moved on. Liam whispered across the aisle. "Do you travel often?" Julian turned his head, half smiling. "Often enough to know airports have personalities." Liam chuckled quietly. "And what's this one like?" Julian looked out the window. "Impatient," he said, "but not beyond redemption." The engine's low hum deepened. The flight attendants began closing the overhead bins. A sense of finality filled the air. Yet the tension lingered thin, invisible, humming like static. Julian opened his notebook again. His handwriting flowed across the page. Observation number 3. Some storms begin with whispers, not thunder. He felt the weight of the moment pressing around him. He wasn't angry. He was observing humanity in its rawest form, ordinary people revealing extraordinary truths without realizing it. "Mrs." Collins caught his eye from 2 rows behind and offered a small, tentative smile. He returned it with warmth. Maybe that was enough for now. Then the intercom crackled. Captain Mitchell's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated as we complete final verification for flight manifest discrepancies." Her words were professional, but the tone wasn't. It was sharp, defensive, heavy with irritation. Julian didn't move. He watched the runway ahead through the oval window, a streak of gray cutting through the white morning light. Inside, something quiet shifted in awareness, a decision forming. He whispered to himself, barely audible above the hum of the engines, "Let's see who we really are today." And the plane began to push back from the gate. The plane's engines settled into a low, steady hum as the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff preparation. Everything looked calm on the surface, but tension buzzed faintly in the air, an invisible thread pulling at every one who had witnessed the earlier exchange. Julian sat quietly, seatbelt buckled, gaze fixed on the small window beside him. The sky was a pale wash of silver. The mountains on the horizon looked half asleep. He could feel the stillness before the storm, the kind that made people uneasy without knowing why. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of the cabin, speaking in a low voice to her first officer, Tom Blake. Though their words were muffled, their body language spoke loudly enough. Sarah's jaw was tight, her shoulders squared in rigid control. Tom nodded obediently, avoiding her eyes. When Sarah finally turned toward Julian, her polite smile looked practiced, not genuine. "Mr. Hayes," she said evenly, "we're having a small issue verifying your ticket through our internal system. It appears your name isn't showing under the first-class manifest." Julian closed his notebook, meeting her gaze. "The gate agent confirmed my seat," he said calmly. "1 Alpha." "Yes, but there seems to be an error," Sarah replied. "We just need to ensure the manifest matches the payment record. It's standard procedure." "Of course," Julian said softly. "I'm familiar with procedure." Richard Holt, seated diagonally across the aisle, leaned forward with an exaggerated sigh. "Captain, do we have to go through all this? Some of us actually have places to be. If there's a mistake, maybe he should just move to economy and let's get this plane moving." A few chuckles rippled faintly from the back rows. Mrs. Collins frowned, looking down at her folded hands. Liam Chen, phone in his lap, silently pressed record. Sarah didn't correct the passenger. Instead, she smiled politely at Holt. "We're resolving it now, sir." Then, with the faintest trace of irritation, she added to Julian, "I'll ask for your cooperation and patience." Julian's voice stayed calm. "You already have both." Tom Blake shifted uncomfortably near the cockpit. He had seen enough of these situations during his early commercial airline days. Passengers singled out for reasons nobody wanted to say aloud. He wanted to speak, but one glance at Sarah's expression kept him quiet. The hum of the air vents filled the silence. Emma Walsh, one of the attendants, stepped forward hesitantly. "Captain," she said in a low tone, "the manifest update might just be delayed." "I saw his boarding pass. Everything looked fine." Sarah shot her a look sharp enough to cut paper. "Thank you. Emma, please return to your station." Emma obeyed, but the flicker of shame in her eyes did not fade. Julian could feel every eye in the front cabin resting on him, each filled with a mix of curiosity and judgment. He felt the old weight pressing against his chest, the familiar, invisible pressure that came from being seen and unseen at the same time. He took a slow breath, then spoke gently, his voice steady enough to quiet the tension. "Captain, would you prefer I show additional identification?" Sarah folded her arms. "If you have a company ID, that would help." Julian reached for his briefcase. His movements were slow, deliberate, composed. He removed his driver's license, a credit card, and a silver Zenith Technologies ID badge. He held them out. "Take your pick." Sarah glanced at the ID, then frowned. "Zenith Technologies," she repeated, as if the words meant nothing. "That's not related to Zenith Aviation." "Actually," Julian said mildly, "it is." Her tone sharpened. "Sir, please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." Before he could answer, Richard Holt scoffed audibly. "I've flown this line for years. They don't usually make mistakes. Maybe his card's a fake." Julian's eyes shifted to Holt, calm and unreadable. "You seem very confident about things that aren't your business." The man smirked. "I'd just like to know who's sitting in the row ahead of me." Liam looked up from his phone, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe you should worry more about where you're sitting." "Sir." The words landed with a soft thud, and Holt's smirk vanished. Sarah cleared her throat sharply. "Gentlemen, let's remain civil." Julian leaned back in his seat, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "I've been civil all morning," he said. Sarah exhaled, clearly losing patience. "Mr. Hayes, if you could step aside, I'll ask security to re-verify your documents at the terminal." Liam's camera was still recording, the little red light glowing faintly in the dim cabin. Julian's voice was barely above a whisper. "You're asking me to deplane because your system can't recognize me. It's for safety and compliance," she said. He studied her face for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. "I see." He picked up his notebook again. Turning to a fresh page, the pen moved silently across the paper. Observation number 4. When doubt wears a uniform, it calls itself safety. Sarah watched him write with irritation she couldn't hide. "Security will meet us at the gate," she announced to no one in particular. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder now. Someone muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another whispered, "Why don't they just let him sit, Emma?" Standing near the galley, bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. She whispered to Tom, "She's going too far." Tom kept his eyes forward. "Don't," he said quietly. "You'll only make it worse." The intercom crackled. A voice from ground control requested confirmation for final clearance. Sarah hesitated, then pressed the button. "Hold position," she replied tersely. "We're resolving a passenger verification issue." Julian looked down at his watch. 8:04 Mem. 12 minutes since the first insult. 12 minutes since he'd decided to let the world reveal itself. He folded his hands and waited. He wasn't angry, he was observing, absorbing, allowing the truth to unfold naturally. It was something his father used to say, "Let people talk long enough, and they'll tell you who they really are." Across the aisle. Liam's post notification pinged softly. His short clip from the gate had just gone live. Within seconds, his followers began commenting. "Who is this man? This looks bad for the airline. Same thing happened to my dad last month." Outside, snow began to fall in faint, wind-blown streaks. Inside, tension
We
thickened
understand the
like
gravity
the air
of the
before a
situation,
thunderstorm.
but the allegations against Zenith
Sarah
do not
returned from
reflect
the
the values
cockpit.
of this
Her
company
voice
or
clipped.
its employees.
"Mr. Hayes, I've requested that airport security meet us at the terminal before departure. Please gather your belongings." Julian didn't move. He simply looked up and said, "That won't be necessary." Something in his tone stopped her mid-step. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority, quiet, commanding, absolute. Her lips parted to protest, but no sound came. Julian looked at the window again, at the snow turning the tarmac white, and said softly to himself, 12 minutes. He knew the test was almost over. The real lesson was about to begin. The moment the cabin door closed, the illusion of calm collapsed. Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice, steady but laced with strain, filled the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll experience a brief delay while we resolve a manifest discrepancy. Please remain seated." The words sounded official enough, but everyone in first class knew exactly what they referred to.
Welcome to the Zenith Foundation.
The glances
We
toward
believe
Julian
in
were no
elevating
longer
the next
subtle.
generation of leaders. And that
Curiosity
starts
had
with
shifted
every
into
single one of you
judgment.
in this room today.
The silence in the cabin grew thick, humming beneath the low drone of the engines. Julian didn't look up from his notebook. He wrote another line in his small, neat handwriting. Observation number 5. Control is most fragile when it feels threatened. Emma Walsh walked down the aisle, clutching a silver tray with bottled water. Her hands trembled slightly as she paused near Julian's seat. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked softly. Julian glanced up, reading the apology in her eyes. "Water's fine. Thank you. Miss Walsh." Her shoulders eased at the use of her name. He'd noticed her badge. She placed the bottle on his table with quiet care and whispered, "I'm sorry about this. It's not right." He gave her a small nod. Sometimes doing the right thing begins with noticing that it isn't being done. Before she could reply, Sarah appeared from the cockpit, striding briskly down the aisle with Tom Blake trailing behind her. Her heels struck the carpet with clip precision. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice firm and sharp as glass. "I'm going to ask one more time. Please gather your things and step off the aircraft." The cabin turned into a theater of silence. Every eye was on them now. Julian looked up slowly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "And I'll answer one more time. Captain," he said quietly, "I've done nothing that requires me to leave this plane." Her nostrils flared. "Sir, your presence has created a disturbance." Julian's brows lifted slightly. "A disturbance," he repeated, "because I followed instructions, took my assigned seat, and stayed quiet." She hesitated, the flaw in her argument visible. Tom shifted awkwardly beside her. "Captain," he started, his voice low. "Maybe we should just—" Sarah cut him off with a sharp motion of her hand. "Not another word." "Tom." Richard Holt let out a loud huff from across the aisle. "For God's sake, just remove him already. We've wasted 20 minutes on this nonsense." Julian turned his head, his tone even. "You seem very eager to see a man humiliated. Mr. Holt, does that make your coffee taste better?" Holt's mouth tightened. "Watch your tone." "I could say the same," Julian replied, still calm, But I suspect we define respect differently. Sarah took a step closer. That's enough. Security is on their way. Her words carried authority, but Julian's stillness unnerved her. He sat with the quiet confidence of someone used to leading rooms far more powerful than hers. The way he looked at her, not angry, not defiant, just profoundly disappointed, made her falter. The door at the front of the cabin opened. 2 uniformed security officers entered, led by Lucas Grant, the head of airport security. Lucas was a tall black man in his early 40s, his face professional but uneasy. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice steady. "You called for assistance." Sarah pointed toward Julian. "Yes. This passenger refused to comply with verification protocols. We need him escorted off immediately." Lucas turned to Julian, studying him for a brief moment. Something in the man's calm demeanor triggered a flicker of recognition. "Sir," he said carefully, "may I see your boarding pass?" Julian handed it over without hesitation. "Of course." Lucas scanned it, his brow furrowed. "It checks out. 1 Alpha, first class. Confirmed." Sarah crossed her arms. "That can't be correct. Our manifest doesn't show his name." Lucas glanced back at her. "With respect, Captain, the system at the gate did. This is valid." Her jaw clenched. "Then it's a glitch. He can still wait outside until it's cleared." Julian spoke before Lucas could respond. "Captain, do you always remove passengers before verifying your own errors?" The question was quiet, but it landed like a gavel. Holt muttered something under his breath. "Mrs." Collins turned around, voice trembling but firm for the first time. "He's done nothing wrong. Leave the man alone." Sarah shot her a cold look. "Ma'am." "I'll ask you to refrain from interfering." The elderly woman straightened in her seat. "And I'll ask you to stop embarrassing this airline." The tension cracked. For a fleeting second, Julian almost smiled. The smallest acts of courage always came from the most unexpected places. Then, without warning, Tom Blake's elbow brushed the tray table, knocking Julian's tablet to the floor. The screen shattered against the edge of the seat base, splintering into a spiderweb of broken glass. The sound sharp, final cut through the cabin. Everyone froze. Julian looked down at the broken tablet, then back at Tom. "That," he said softly, "was unnecessary." Tom opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah interjected quickly. "It was an accident." Julian leaned forward slightly. "Accidents are when intentions and consequences don't match. This one matched perfectly." Lucas took a step closer. "Captain, I suggest we de-escalate." But Sarah's pride had already taken control. "Officer, do your job. Remove him now." Lucas hesitated. The room seemed to shrink around them, the hum of the engines turning into a pulse in the background. Julian stood slowly. He was taller than she'd realized. The quiet authority in his presence made the entire cabin feel smaller. He met Lucas's gaze. "You don't need to remove me, officer. But before you act on her command, call Zenith headquarters. Ask for Eleanor Ruiz, legal counsel. Tell her Dr. Hayes is being forcibly removed from his own aircraft." Sarah blinked, confusion flashing across her face. What Julian looked at her calmly. "My aircraft. My company." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words themselves carried weight steady. Absolute. Irrefutable. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Then Lucas reached for his radio. "HQ Control. This is Security 1, he said quietly. "I need verification on a Dr. Julian Hayes, Zenith Technologies and Zenith Aviation." The radio crackled. A voice answered, firm and certain. Confirmed. Dr. Hayes is the CEO and owner of Zenith. Is there a problem? Sarah's face drained of color. Holt sank back into his seat. Tom swallowed hard. Julian remained still. Expression unreadable. No, he said gently. No problem at all. We're just clarifying procedures. He turned to Sarah. Would you like to continue? Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julian retrieved his broken tablet, running his thumb over the cracked glass. Then, softly, almost to himself, he murmured, 12 minutes. The clock on the cabin wall read 8:12. The test was over. The reckoning had begun. When Lucas Grant's radio confirmed the truth that the man standing calmly before them was the CEO and owner of Zenith Aviation, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. It was as if gravity had changed. Every breath seemed heavier, and every whisper carried consequence. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood frozen, her authority draining from her face like ink running in water. For years she had commanded cabins with certainty. But now, under the quiet gaze of the man she had tried to expel, she looked smaller, reduced to someone trying to outrun her own reflection. Tom Blake lowered his head. Captain, he murmured, voice trembling slightly, we should apologize. Sarah turned sharply toward him. Not now. But the words were hollow. Even she could hear it. Julian stayed silent. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. His calmness was worse than anger. It was the kind of composure that forced people to see themselves. Lucas handed back the boarding pass. Dr. Hayes, he said, tone respectful now. I apologize for the misunderstanding. It appears there's been a serious error. Julian nodded slightly. Yes, officer. And it wasn't the system that made it. The meaning landed hard. Sarah flinched. In the next seat over, Liam Chen's phone vibrated. His short clip from earlier, the one showing Sarah confronting Julian at the gate, had crossed 300,000 views in less than 20 minutes. The caption read, Black passenger denied seat in first class, but watch how calm he stays. He hadn't named the airline yet. Not yet. But now, seeing the way everyone had gone pale, the truth seemed heavier in his hands. Julian looked toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time. He didn't need to speak. The look alone said, Tell the truth. Liam nodded slowly. Then he typed the next post. Update. The passenger they profiled is Dr. Julian Hayes, the CEO of Zenith Technologies and owner of the very airline they're flying on. This just got real. He hit post. The notification sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but that single action, the quiet tap of a thumb, ignited a storm. Within minutes, the first comments appeared. Wait, the CEO. This can't be real. Justice in real time. By the time the plane had been stationary for 10 more minutes, the video was trending. News outlets began quoting the footage, resharing it with captions like, Power meets prejudice at 30,000 feet. Sarah's voice shook. Turn off your phone, she snapped at Liam. Recording on a private aircraft violates policy. Liam didn't answer. His camera kept rolling. Julian turned his gaze toward her, soft but firm. The policy you're referring to, Captain, belongs to my company.
We understand the
I wrote
gravity of
it,
the situation,
and I
but
assure
the
you it
allegations
allows
against Zenith
transparency.
do not reflect the
She
values
froze
of this
again.
company or its
Mrs.
employees.
Collins, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly, whispered to the woman beside her, He's the owner, my lord. The woman nodded, and they treated him like that. The ripple of murmurs moved through the cabin like a wave. Tom finally broke his silence. His voice cracked. Dr. Hayes? I'm sorry. I should have said something earlier. Julian looked at him evenly. You still can." The words hung between them, heavy but not cruel. Emma, standing near the galley, spoke next, her voice small but brave. "Dr. Hayes, I saw what happened. I wanted to stop it. I didn't know who you were, but it didn't matter. It was wrong." He gave her a quiet nod. "That's how right things begin. Miss Walsh, when someone notices the wrong before it becomes normal." A few passengers clapped softly. The sound was hesitant but heartfelt. Richard Holt scowled. "Oh, come
To
on.
the Zenith Foundation.
Are we doing this?
We believe in
You
elevating the
people
next
are acting
generation
like
of leaders.
saints now."
And that starts with every single
Julian's
one of you
eyes
in this
moved to
room
him,
today.
calm and unblinking. "We're just remembering what decency looks like. Mr. Holt, it's been missing from this cabin." The man shrank back into his seat, face flushing red. Then Lucas' radio crackled again. "HQ confirms Dr. Hayes' authority on board," the voice said. "You're to comply with any instructions he gives." Julian inhaled slowly. He hadn't wanted to reach this point. He had hoped the test would end with awareness, not exposure. But it was beyond that now. It had become something larger, a mirror for an entire system that had forgotten empathy. He stood, his voice low but commanding. "Captain Mitchell," he said, "I want you to call the terminal. Inform them this flight is grounded until further notice." Her head snapped up. "You can't just, I can," he interrupted quietly. "And I have." He turned to Lucas. "Please notify HQ that we're activating internal protocol. All logs from this flight are to be preserved and sent to legal review." Lucas nodded. "Yes, sir." Sarah's hands trembled. "You're making a mistake. This will ruin my record." Julian met her eyes. "No, Captain, your choices did that." Liam caught the moment on video, the shift in power so quiet yet monumental that even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Outside, snow still drifted across the tarmac, soft and indifferent. Inside, history was being rewritten at 8:23 a.m. The comments under Liam's post exploded. He grounded the plane. "This is leadership. Watch how calm he is." Julian looked around the cabin. Some passengers avoided his gaze. Others watched him with newfound respect. "Mrs." Collins reached out and touched his sleeve lightly. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, "for staying calm. I don't think I could have." He smiled gently. Sometimes calm is the loudest way to speak. Then he addressed everyone in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you an apology for what you've had to witness, but I also owe you transparency. What happened today wasn't just a personal insult. It was a test of a culture we all live in, a test of whether power still respects humanity." His voice was soft, but it filled the room with something that sounded like truth. Liam stopped filming for a second. He just watched. It wasn't every day you saw dignity redefine power in real time. "Captain," Julian said finally, "you and your crew will remain on board. Legal will contact you shortly. For now, the flight is suspended. Passengers will disembark shortly." Sarah didn't argue. Her hands shook as she reached for the intercom, her voice barely holding steady. "Attention passengers. We've been delayed for operational review. Please remain seated until instructed." Julian sat down again, exhaling slowly. For the first time that morning, he felt something like sadness, not for himself, but for how easily respect could vanish when faced with difference. He opened his notebook once more. Observation number 6. Justice isn't loud. It's the sound of silence, learning to listen. And as the cabin lights dimmed, his phone buzzed quietly. A message from headquarters flashed across the screen. "Annika Sharma, Executive Assistant Dr. Hayes, Liam Chen's video just hit 2 million views. Media outlets are calling. FAA requesting statement. Julian looked out the window, where snow met sunlight in the distance. Good, he whispered. Then they'll see what respect really looks like. By the time the first-class cabin lights flickered back on, the world outside had already changed. Liam's post had crossed 5 million views. News alerts began to pulse across phones. Headlines flashed in real-time Zenith. CEO grounded his own plane. After racial profiling incident, the passengers didn't need Wi-Fi to feel the storm. They could sense it in the air, a charge that made every breath sharp, every sound amplified. Julian sat motionless, hands folded loosely in his lap. He had spoken little since grounding the flight. The silence wasn't weakness, it was control. Every second he waited, the truth grew louder on its own. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood near the cockpit, her voice low, arguing in whispers with Tom. "You don't understand. If this goes public, my career is over." Tom rubbed the back of his neck. "Sarah, it already is. You picked the wrong man to test." She turned sharply. "I followed procedure. You saw the manifest. You saw the badge." Tom's eyes flicked toward Julian. "Yeah, I saw. But I also saw how you looked at him." Her expression hardened. "You think this is about race?" Tom didn't answer, and that silence spoke more than any accusation could. Emma watched them from the galley, her heart thudding. She had been a flight attendant for 7 years, long enough to know when something was broken, beyond fixing. But today wasn't just about rules. It was about courage. She looked at Julian, then at the other passengers, and finally said what no one else dared to. "Captain, maybe it's time you stop defending what's wrong." Sarah's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me." Emma's voice trembled, but didn't break. "He didn't do anything wrong. You treated him like a threat because he didn't look like what you expected. That's not procedure. That's prejudice." The word sliced through the cabin. A few passengers nodded quietly. Sarah's lips tightened. "You're out of line, Miss Walsh." Julian turned his gaze to Emma, his expression soft. "Actually, Captain," he said calmly, "she's the only one here who's in line." Liam's camera caught the exchange. He didn't need to say anything. The truth had its own rhythm now. "Mrs. Collins," her voice small but steady, added, "you can't fix something if you won't admit it's broken." The flight attendant from economy peeked through the curtain, curiosity written all over her face. She whispered, "Is it true? He's the CEO." Emma nodded silently. At that same moment, Julian's phone buzzed. It was a call from Elena Ruiz, Zenith's corporate counsel. He answered with a calm, "Yes, Elena." Her voice came through crisp and urgent. "Dr. Hayes, the footage is everywhere. Media outlets are requesting statements. We've initiated internal review protocols. The board is standing by." "Good," Julian said softly. "Keep him there. I'll be sending my own statement soon." He ended the call, then looked at Lucas Grant. "Officer, please make sure all flight records from the last 24 hours are preserved. That includes cabin audio, manifest logs, and crew communications." Lucas nodded. "Already done, sir." Julian gave him a brief, approving look. "Thank you for your integrity." Sarah scoffed quietly. "Integrity. You're humiliating us in front of the world." Julian finally turned to her fully, his calm now carrying the sharp edge of truth. "No, Captain, I didn't humiliate you. You did that the moment you forgot the difference between authority and respect." Her shoulders tensed. For the first time, she looked less like a pilot and more like a person who realized she'd built her identity on power. She didn't understand. Julian stood slowly. His movement was deliberate. Every inch a reminder that true power doesn't raise its voice. It simply rises. He addressed the cabin, his tone even but resonant. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no longer about a misunderstanding. It's about something much larger. It's about what happens when assumptions become policies and when dignity becomes negotiable. The passengers were silent, captivated. Even Holt, the loudest voice of mockery, sat wordless now. Julian continued, "For too long, people have been told they don't belong in rooms, in companies, in seats they've rightfully earned. But belonging isn't a privilege someone grants. It's a right we all carry the moment we step through the door." Liam's camera shook slightly. His breath caught in his throat as he realized he was witnessing something far bigger than a viral post. Julian looked directly at Sarah. "You asked me to prove who I am. But the truth is, I shouldn't have to. No one should." The cabin was utterly still. The sound of the snow tapping the window was the only movement left. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. For a brief moment. She wasn't the captain. She was just a person who'd finally met the mirror she'd avoided all her life. Tom Blake spoke softly. "Dr. Hayes, if I could take back what happened, I would." Julian gave him a quiet nod. "Then learn from it. Don't take it back. Take it forward." Emma covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Mrs." Collins reached out and squeezed her hand gently. Outside, the sky began to brighten, the first streaks of sunlight breaking through the fading storm clouds. Julian opened his notebook again, writing his next line slowly, deliberately. Observation 7. Some storms clear only after they've shown us what needs washing away. He closed it and looked at Lucas. "Officer, please inform air traffic control that this flight will remain grounded until I speak with my headquarters directly." Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." As he walked toward the cockpit, Sarah muttered bitterly, "You think this makes you a hero?" Julian's answer was calm but firm. "No, Captain. Heroes fix what others broke. I'm just refusing to let it stay broken." Liam caught that, too. He knew it would become the quote the world would remember. Moments later, a ping echoed through the
understand the
cabin,
gravity of the
the
situation,
intercom
but
flashing
the
with a
allegations
message from
against
Zenith
Zenith do
HQ.
not reflect the values of this
Elena
company
Ruiz's
or
voice
its
filled the
employees.
air, composed and precise. "This is Elena Ruiz, Corporate Counsel for Zenith Technologies, effective immediately. Captain Sarah Mitchell, First Officer Tom Blake, and Flight Attendant Emma Walsh are relieved of duty pending investigation into the events aboard this aircraft. Dr. Hayes, full authority has been transferred to your command." Gas filled the cabin. Emma looked stricken, shaking her head. "Wait, no. Please." Julian raised a hand gently. "Elena, strike Miss Walsh from that list." She spoke truth when silence was easier. That kind of courage doesn't need punishment. It needs protection. Elena's voice softened. "Understood. Dr. Hayes." Sarah looked stunned. "You can't just fire me mid-flight." Julian's eyes met hers one last time. "I didn't fire you, Captain. You did that the moment you forgot the sky belongs to everyone." The intercom went silent.
Welcome to the Zenith
And for the
Foundation.
first time all morning,
We believe in elevating
so
the
did
next
Sarah.
generation of leaders, and that
Outside,
starts with every single one
dawn
of you
had
in this room
brightened
today.
into a sharp, crystalline morning. The snow that had drifted through the early hours was melting on the tarmac, turning into thin streaks of silver water. Inside the grounded aircraft, the air felt electric, like the moment before thunder. Julian Hayes remained in seat 1A, quiet and composed, as news spread beyond the cabin walls. His phone vibrated with constant alerts mentions, tags, live broadcasts, interviews already analyzing what had happened. It had been only 40 minutes since he'd said the words, "This plane stays grounded." Yet already, millions of people were watching, dissecting, and taking sides. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of it all. He hadn't planned to go viral. He had only planned to reveal truth, not to humiliate, not to grandstand, but to expose the quiet rot that hides behind uniforms and procedures. Emma approached timidly. "Dr. Hayes," she said softly, "the passengers are asking if they can disembark. They're starting to get nervous." Julian nodded. "Of course. Let them go. Make sure they're treated with courtesy. Offer water and assistance if needed." Emma blinked, surprised at his calm. "You're not angry." He gave her a gentle smile. "Anger changes little. Action changes everything." She nodded, her throat tight, and turned to help the others. "In the back, Mrs." Collins touched Julian's shoulder as she passed. "You did something important today," she whispered. He looked at her kindly. "We all did, ma'am. You spoke when silence was easier. That matters." She smiled faintly and made her way down the aisle. As passengers filed out, the crew stood in uneasy silence. Tom Blake avoided Julian's eyes. Sarah Mitchell sat motionless near the cockpit, her cap resting in her lap. The authority she had once worn like armor now felt like weight. Outside the window, several airport security vehicles and media vans had gathered near the terminal. Cameramen were already setting up. Liam Chen's phone kept buzzing with notification after notification. His video had now reached over 20 million views. Every major network wanted to interview him. His name trended beside Julian's. Dr. Julian Hayes and Grounded for Justice were climbing the charts. He hesitated, glancing at Julian. "Sir," he said quietly, "they're calling this the 12-minute revolution. People are furious, but also inspired. They're saying you changed how power should look." Julian gave a small chuckle. "Power doesn't change. Only people do when they finally see what it's been doing to them." Liam nodded slowly. "Would you like me to stop posting? I can take everything down if you want." Julian looked out the window for a moment. The sunlight reflected in his eyes, making them look like amber glass. "No," he said finally. "The truth doesn't need hiding. Let them see it. Let them talk about it. Maybe someone will start listening." Meanwhile, in Zenith's downtown headquarters, Elena Ruiz was already in a conference room surrounded by executives and screens flashing live coverage. She was calm but sharp, giving orders through her headset. "Activate full PR response," she said. "We control the narrative with truth, not defense." "Confirmed, Doctor." Hayes' statement he acted within company policy and values. "We emphasize that Zenith stands for equity, not image." Annika Sharma's voice came through the line. "Doctor, Hayes hasn't made a public comment yet. Media are waiting outside terminals in 4 states." Elena glanced at the clock. "He will when he's ready. He always is." Back on the plane, Lucas Grant approached Julian. "Dr. Hayes, the FAA regional director, is on the line. They're asking for your version of events before issuing a statement." Julian nodded. "Patch it through." Lucas handed him the phone. Julian spoke evenly. "This is Dr. Hayes. I have nothing to add beyond the truth already visible to the world. What happened on this plane wasn't an aviation issue. It was a human one. But I assure you, it will be addressed systemically." His words were clipped, professional, but behind them lay something larger, something unspoken, a promise. When he hung up, he noticed Sarah still sitting there, staring blankly ahead. For the first time, she looked completely lost. He walked toward her. "Captain," he said gently. She didn't look up. "I suppose this is where it ends?" Julian paused. "That depends on what you mean by it. Your job, maybe, but your story? It's still being written." She finally met his gaze. "You could destroy me." He shook his head. "I don't destroy people. I expose moments, and what people do with those moments decides the rest." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Julian continued quietly. "The world's watching. Sarah, not to see you punished, but to see if anyone learns." He turned and walked back to his seat. Outside, camera flashes began reflecting through the cabin windows. Liam stepped closer to Julian, almost hesitant. "They're asking for a statement. Sir, if you say something now, it could set the tone for everything." Julian took a moment. The hum of the cabin had faded into near silence. He opened his notebook again, that same one filled with quiet truths, and tore out a single page. He handed it to Liam. "Read this aloud when you post your next update. My words don't need my face. They just need to reach someone who'll hear them." Liam looked down at the handwritten note. It read, "To everyone watching. What happened here today isn't rare. It just happened to be recorded. Every silent injustice, every small humiliation, every person made to prove they belong, these are the moments that shape the world we live in. Don't let this story end as another headline. Let it be the beginning of how we treat each other better." When Liam read it aloud for his live stream, the comments flooded instantly. "That's leadership." "I cried." "He said what we all feel." Within minutes, the clip reached 50 million views. The world had its soundbite, but more importantly, it had its reflection. As the last passenger stepped off, Julian remained alone in the cabin for a moment. The sunlight poured through the windows now, washing over the seats like quiet absolution. He looked around at the space that had turned from battleground to classroom and whispered to himself, "Sometimes you have to ground a plane to lift people higher." Outside, news anchors repeated his name across every screen in America, and somewhere deep in the heart of the country, people who had been unseen felt a little more visible. It was nearly noon by the time Julian stepped off the plane. The air outside was cold and sharp, carrying the kind of stillness that follows chaos. Dozens of cameras and reporters lined the terminal windows. The flash of lenses painted the glass with white bursts of light. Security agents cleared a path as he walked. Lucas Grant stayed a few steps behind him, not as a guard, but as quiet support. Emma followed at a respectful distance, holding a clipboard and trying to stay composed amid the noise. "Dr. Hayes, Dr. Hayes, can you comment on the incident? Was this a publicity stunt or a corporate experiment? Do you believe racial bias exists in your own company?" Julian didn't answer. His silence carried more power than their questions. Each step he took seemed to absorb the chaos around him. At the far end of the corridor, Elena Ruiz was waiting, surrounded by Zenith's internal team and public relations advisors. She greeted him with a small nod. "Welcome back to ground." "Sir?" Julian exhaled, offering a faint smile. "I've been grounded before, Elena, but never quite like this." They moved into a private conference room overlooking the runway. From there, Julian could still see the plane, his plane sitting motionless in the sunlight. It looked ordinary from the outside, but he knew it had just become a symbol. Elena began briefing him. "We've issued a preliminary statement confirming the incident. Media outlets are spinning the story as both a racial injustice and a leadership test. Your video statement was received well over 80% positive sentiment." 80%, Julian repeated softly. That means 20% still doesn't understand. Elena hesitated. There are critics saying you staged the incident, that you intentionally provoked it to make a statement. Julian leaned back. Truth doesn't need a script. It just needs a moment. Annika Sharma joined them via video call, her voice calm but tinged with fatigue. Dr. Hayes, your calendar is flooded. CNN, the New York Times, BBC, everyone wants your statement. Hashtags are trending in 20 countries. Julian rubbed his temple slowly. And what about the staff? The employees at Zenith Aviation? Elena replied. There's shock, but also pride. Many are writing open letters saying your actions gave them courage. He nodded slightly. That's good. Courage needs somewhere to land. He walked toward the window. Outside, reporters still swarmed near the aircraft, pointing, gesturing, speculating. It reminded him of something his father once said. When you stand for something true, son, people will always circle some to see you fall, others to see if they can stand beside you. Elena's phone buzzed. It's the FAA director, she said. He wants to schedule a meeting. They're launching an independent review of airline conduct. Julian turned. Set it up, but I don't want punishment. I want reform. This isn't about one crew. It's about the culture that built them. Has she made the arrangements?
We understand the gravity
Julian's
of the situation,
mind drifted
but
back
the allegations
to the look
against
on Captain
Zenith
Mitchell's
do not
face
reflect the
when
values
she
of this
realized
company
who he
or
was.
its
The fear,
employees.
the shame, the unraveling of certainty. It wasn't triumph he felt then. It was sadness, because he knew how many others like her existed, people shaped by systems that rewarded suspicion and punished empathy. Across the city, television screens flashed his image. Morning talk shows debated his motives. Commentators split along familiar lines. Some praised his restraint. Others accused him of grandstanding. The footage played on endless loop, Julian sitting calmly as chaos swirled around him. In one studio, an anchor asked, "Why does it take power to be treated with dignity?" In another, a former pilot defended Sarah Mitchell, saying, "Pilots have to make quick decisions." Maybe she acted on instinct. The country was talking, arguing, reflecting, and for the first time in a while, listening. That afternoon, Julian's phone rang again. It was Emma. Her voice trembled slightly.
Welcome to the Zenith
Dr.
Foundation.
Hayes,
We believe in elevating
I
the
just
next
wanted to
generation
thank
of
you
leaders, and that
for
starts with
protecting
every
me.
single one of you in
The
this
legal
room today.
department said I'm being reassigned to Zenith Training Division. He smiled. That's fitting. You've already started teaching. She laughed softly, then paused. And Captain Mitchell Julian was quiet for a moment. She'll have her hearing. I've asked that it be fair, not merciless. Growth begins where humiliation ends. Later that day, Liam Chen uploaded another video, this time not about confrontation, but reflection. He sat on a bench outside the terminal, the sun setting behind him, speaking directly to the camera. I saw something on that plane that I'll never forget, he said. A man who could have shouted, didn't. A crew who thought power meant control, and a world that watched and realized silence can be louder than outrage. What Dr. Hayes did wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. The video gained over 20 million views in 2 hours. People began sharing their own stories, stories of being profiled, doubted, dismissed. The hashtag evolved into something bigger. My See Me First. Inside Zenith headquarters, Julian sat at his desk long after everyone else had left. The city lights reflected in the glass wall behind him. His office was filled with quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has cleared, but the air still carries its scent. He opened his notebook again, writing slowly. Observation. Number 8. Real change doesn't happen when the world looks. It happens when the world looks inward. A knock came at the door. Elena stepped in, holding her tablet. Dr. Hayes, we've been asked to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Ethics. They want your input on policy reform. Julian looked up, eyes steady. Then we'll go. But I won't talk about regulations. I'll talk about humanity. She smiled faintly. You always do. He closed his notebook and glanced once more toward the skyline. The city shimmered in the fading light. Somewhere, a news helicopter hovered, its spotlight sweeping across the glass towers. Julian whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Maybe grounding that plane was the easiest part. Now we have to teach it how to fly right again. 2 weeks later, Washington, D.C., was gray with winter rain. The marble steps of the Capitol glistened under the drizzle as camera crews and reporters gathered along the barricades. The world was waiting to hear the man whose 12 minutes had shaken an industry. Inside, the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation Ethics was in session. The room was vast oak walls, polished microphones, cameras silently rolling. Senators whispered among themselves as the hearing prepared to begin. At the center table sat Dr. Julian Hayes, flanked by Elena Ruiz and Anaka Sharma. His expression was composed, his posture impeccable. He wasn't here as a victim. He was here as a witness and as a teacher. Across from him, a row of senators glanced through briefing papers. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical. They saw the headlines, the trending hashtags, the protests outside airports across the country. But they didn't yet understand the man behind it. The chairman cleared his throat. Dr. Hayes, thank you for being here today. The committee recognizes you as the CEO of Zenith Technologies and owner of Zenith Aviation. We understand you were involved in an incident that has raised serious questions about bias in the aviation industry. Julian nodded. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss not just what happened, but what it revealed. He paused, letting silence settle in the room before continuing. When people ask about that day, they often focus on the moment I identified myself as the owner. But the truth is, what mattered wasn't my title. It was how invisible I was before I said it. For 12 minutes. I was not a CEO. I was just another black man whose presence had to be verified. The words landed heavy. Even the cameras seemed to go still. He continued, his voice low but clear. This wasn't the first time I've been mistaken for someone who didn't belong. It happens in boardrooms, in first-class cabins, in my own buildings. The uniform changes, but the instinct stays the same, an instinct to question rather than to welcome. A senator leaned forward. Dr. Hayes, are you suggesting systemic discrimination is common in aviation? Julian looked at him steadily. I'm suggesting it's common in life. Aviation just gave it wings. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Helena's pen moved quickly across her notes. Capturing his phrasing, she knew it would echo far beyond this room. Julian continued, I didn't ground that plane to humiliate anyone. I grounded it because I wanted everyone on board, myself included, to face the truth. That authority without empathy is just fear wearing a badge. He let that hang for a beat. Since that incident, he said, Zenith has begun an internal review of every policy related to passenger treatment, hiring, and bias training. We're launching the Zenith Equity Program, aimed at creating a transparent system where every voice from pilot to passenger is accountable. The chairman nodded thoughtfully. And what about the crew involved in your flight? Julian's expression softened. Captain Sarah Mitchell is under review, but I've requested her evaluation focus on rehabilitation, not termination. We don't need more ruined lives. We need changed hearts. There was silence, not from disinterest, but respect. A senator on the far left spoke up, voice firm. Dr. Hayes, some have accused you of leveraging your position for personal gain using an unfortunate misunderstanding to promote your company's brand. How do you respond to that? Julian smiled faintly. Brand, no. What I promoted was accountability, and if doing the right thing makes my company stronger, I'll consider that a sign we're doing something right. Across the room, Liam Chen sat in the press gallery. He wasn't recording this time. He was just watching, taking notes by hand. He could feel the gravity of the moment, how Julian's calmness disarmed defensiveness, how truth was reshaping the air in the room. Julian leaned forward slightly, his tone deepening. I don't want this hearing to end with apologies. I want it to begin with commitments. Policies mean nothing without conscience. Diversity reports mean nothing without decency. You can't train humanity, but you can remind it. One of the senators, an older woman with silver hair, spoke softly. Dr. Hayes, if you could speak directly to every pilot, every passenger, every person watching this today, what would you tell them? Julian turned slightly toward the camera, his gaze steady, his words measured. I'd tell them that justice doesn't live in grand gestures. It lives in moments. The moment you choose to listen instead of dismiss, to question yourself before judging others, to let compassion outrank convenience. He paused. We talk about equality like it's an idea. It's not. It's a practice, one we have to rehearse every single day. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the sound technicians had stopped typing. Julian closed his folder and added, I've built planes my whole life, not with wings, but with opportunities. And if this experience has taught me anything, it's that the highest flight a person can take is not through the clouds, but above their own prejudice. When he finished, there was silence, then unexpectedly applause. It wasn't loud or ceremonial. It was quiet, reverent, and real. Liam felt his throat tighten. He knew he was watching history being written not by force, but by grace. After the session ended, reporters flooded the hallway, shouting questions. Julian stopped for one brief statement. We've talked long enough about equality, he said. Now we build systems that live it. That night, his speech aired across every network. News anchors replayed his words again and again. Social media filled with messages, some praising, some skeptical, but all engaged. For the first time in a long time, the conversation wasn't about outrage. It was about reflection. In her small apartment miles away, Captain Sarah Mitchell watched the hearing alone. The sound from the TV washed over her like something between guilt and redemption. When Julian said rehabilitation, not termination, she covered her face with her hands and wept quietly. At Zenith headquarters, Emma Walsh received an email. Congratulations, Ms. Walsh. You've been appointed as lead instructor for the new Human Dignity and Training Initiative. She stared at it for a long time before whispering to herself, he meant it. And in a small cafe in San Francisco, Liam Chen uploaded one final post for the night. Today, I watched a man redefine power. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. Julian sat in his hotel room overlooking the Capitol dome, notebook open in front of him. He wrote one final line before closing it for the night. Observation. Number 9. Change doesn't roar. It breathes one quiet truth at a time. He looked out the window, the rain still falling, the city lights gleaming through the mist. And for the first time since that flight, he allowed himself to exhale, not in relief, but in hope. 3 months had passed since the day the world watched a man stand his ground on his own plane. What began as a single confrontation had evolved into something far greater, a conversation stretching across continents, industries, and
We
hearts.
understand the gravity of the situation.
In the weeks
but
following the
allegations
Senate hearing,
against Zenith do not
aviation
reflect the
companies
values of
across
this
the
company
country
or
began
its
issuing
employees.
statements. Some promised training reforms, others quietly updated their policies. But only one company, Zenith Aviation, turned promises into measurable action. Julian sat in the boardroom of Zenith headquarters, the morning sun spilling across the glass table. On the wall behind him hung a new motto engraved in brushed steel, "Dignity at Altitude." Eleanor Ruiz entered, carrying a thick folder. "Here's the latest report on implementation," she said, setting it before him. 78% of staff have completed the empathy and bias response course. The feedback's been overwhelming and not all easy. Julian smiled faintly. "Growth never is." She nodded. "We've also partnered with 3 airlines for cross-company training. They're adopting our True Sky auditing system. The FAA called it the most comprehensive equity framework in aviation history." Julian leaned back, his eyes reflecting quiet satisfaction.
Welcome to the Zenith Foundation.
"That's good.
We believe
Let's
in
make sure it
elevating
stays
the
about
next generation
people,
of leaders.
not
And that
publicity."
starts with every
Across
single
the
one of you
table,
in this room today.
Annika scrolled through her tablet. "We're getting letters from passengers, hundreds a week. People who say they were treated differently, seen differently. Some even say they were inspired to speak up for others." Julian looked out the window. Down below, one of the newly repainted Zenith jets was taxiing down the runway. Its tail bore the new insignia, a silver horizon cutting through a golden sky. "Change always looks small at first," he said softly. "Like the horizon. You don't realize how far it stretches until you start walking toward it." At that same hour, across the country, Sarah Mitchell sat in a small classroom in a community aviation center in Denver. Her posture was no longer proud. It was humble, attentive. Before her, a retired black pilot named Captain Reuben Cross spoke about the history of exclusion in flight schools. His voice was calm, his stories raw. When the session ended, Sarah lingered, approaching him quietly. "Captain Cross," she said, "I wanted to thank you. I've been reading, studying, listening. I thought I understood leadership, but I didn't understand humanity." The older man studied her face. "Understanding's a flight, Captain. You don't reach it overnight, but you're flying the right direction now." Outside, snow began to fall, the kind that muffled everything in stillness. Sarah walked to her car slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. For the first time in months, she felt something return, not her pride, but her purpose. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Liam Chen was preparing to film his next segment. He'd built an entirely new show, The Human Altitude Project. Each episode told stories of ordinary people confronting injustice in quiet but powerful ways. As he adjusted his camera, he thought about Julian's words from the Senate. Hearing justice doesn't live in grand gestures. It lives in moments. He looked into the lens and began. "Today, I want to talk about what happens after the applause, about how change survives once the headlines fade." His voice carried the same steady conviction Julian had once shown him. And his audience, now millions strong, listened. Back in Denver, Emma Walsh stood before a group of new flight attendants in a training hall. Her presentation slides bore the Zenith logo and the title, "The First Flight of Respect." She looked at the room filled with nervous recruits and said gently, "You'll be the first faces people see when they fly with us. That makes you more powerful than you think. You can either remind passengers of fear or remind them of dignity." A hand went up from the back. "Ms. Walsh, how do you stay calm when someone disrespects you?" Emma smiled softly. "By remembering that their behavior isn't a reflection of my worth, it's a test of my grace." The class fell silent, absorbing her words. Later that evening, Julian attended a live-streamed town hall at Zenith's main terminal. Hundreds of employees filled the space. Thousands more watched online. He stepped up to the podium, his voice measured but warm. "When I was younger," he began, "my father told me something I didn't understand until that day on the plane. He said, 'Son, power isn't about getting the last word. It's about making sure the next one is worth hearing.'" He looked around the room. "That's what we're doing here. Not rewriting the sky, but reteaching it to listen." Applause spread through the hall, not thunderous, but deep, rhythmic, sincere. After the event, he found a letter waiting for him on his desk. The handwriting was elegant, written in blue ink. He recognized the name at the bottom before even reading it. Sarah Mitchell. He opened it slowly. "Dr. Hayes, I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I've joined the equity program as a volunteer. I'm speaking to young pilots about humility, about awareness. Every day I remember your words. Authority without empathy is fear wearing a badge. I think I finally understand. Thank you for not giving up on people like me. Respectfully, Sarah Mitchell." Julian closed the letter, resting it gently on his desk. His reflection in the glass window looked older, steadier, more at peace. Later that night, as he left the building, he saw the Denver skyline shining beneath a canopy of stars. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it was changing one policy, one person, one story at a time. At a crosswalk, a man recognized him. "Dr. Hayes," he called out. "You don't know me, but I watched that video. You made me rethink how I treat my employees. Thank you, man. For real." Julian smiled. "Keep that thought flying." He crossed the street, the hum of the city wrapping around him like a quiet promise. Back in his apartment, he sat down at his desk, opened his old notebook, and wrote his next observation. Observation numéro 10. True leadership isn't about being seen first. It's about making sure others aren't seen last. He closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and turned off the lamp. Through the window, he could see a plane ascending into the night sky, steady, quiet, unbroken. Somewhere out there, someone would be sitting in first class, another in economy, and maybe for once, neither would matter. What would matter was how they looked at each other and saw a fellow human being, not a seat number. And that, Julian thought, was the flight worth taking. Spring came quietly to Denver that year. The snow had melted from the foothills, and the city seemed softer, somehow less hurried, more human. At Zenith headquarters, sunlight streamed through the lobby windows, casting gold across a new banner that read the Zenith Fund, lifting the next generation. It was launch day. Months of planning had led to this, a $30 million endowment dedicated to supporting underrepresented youth in aviation, engineering, and leadership. The fund wasn't just a scholarship. It was a bridge. Julian stood backstage, listening to the low hum of the audience gathering in the main hall. Executives, educators, community leaders, even high school students all seated beneath the glowing blue Zenith logo projected above the stage. Annika approached, tablet in hand. Everything set. "Media's live in 5 minutes," she said, her voice steady. Julian smiled at her. "You've handled all of this beautifully, Annika." She returned the smile. "You taught me well. Now it's your turn to teach them." He chuckled softly. "No lectures today. Just a promise." As he walked onto the stage, applause filled the air. He paused a moment, taking it in not as admiration, but as shared momentum. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm yet resonant. "A few months ago, a simple flight reminded me how high we can soar and how far we still have to climb together." He looked out at the crowd of young faces. "That day, I learned that power without purpose is just turbulence. But when we channel it toward justice, it becomes lift." The audience listened intently as he continued. "The Zenith Fund exists for every young person who was ever told they didn't belong in the cockpit, the boardroom, or anywhere dreams demand permission. This fund says, you do belong." The applause swelled again. Cameras flashed. From her seat near the front, Emma Walsh watched with tears glistening in her eyes. She remembered the quiet fear of that flight, and how Julian's calm had given her courage. Now she was part of something bigger, something that turned pain into progress. Julian turned slightly toward the audience's left side. There, among the crowd, sat Sarah Mitchell. She hadn't wanted special attention, but Elena had insisted she attend. Her eyes met Julian's for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement of redemption, not forgiveness. When the ceremony ended, people gathered around Julian, shaking his hand, thanking him, but after a while, he slipped out quietly onto the balcony overlooking the city. The air carried the scent of rain and blooming lilacs. He stood there for a long moment, watching a plane rise slowly into the sky. "It's strange," he murmured to himself. "We build machines to defy gravity, but it's our hearts that keep us grounded." "Behind him," a soft voice replied, "and sometimes it takes falling to learn how to rise." It was Sarah. She had followed him out, hesitant but sincere. Julian turned and smiled gently. "I'm glad you came." She nodded, her expression earnest. "I almost didn't. I thought maybe my presence would take away from what this day means." He shook his head. "Your presence adds to it. You're proof that change doesn't just happen, it's chosen." Her eyes welled slightly. "I still think about that day, about how fast I judged, about the kind of pilot I used to be." Julian looked at her kindly. "And now you're helping others not make the same mistake. That's more than redemption, that's leadership." She smiled faintly, emotion trembling in her voice. "I never said thank you for showing me grace when I least deserved it." Julian placed a hand over his heart. "Grace isn't earned, it's extended." They stood there in quiet understanding, the city humming softly below. Later that evening, after the event ended and the building had emptied, Julian sat alone in his office. The skyline outside glowed with warm light. His desk was covered with letters, handwritten notes from students who had received the first Zenith Fund scholarships. He picked one up from a boy in Atlanta. "Dear Dr. Hayes,
We understand the
my
gravity
mom
of the
showed me your
situation,
video.
but the
I
allegations
want to be a
against Zenith
pilot
do not
someday.
reflect the values
People
of this
say
company
it's too
or
hard
its
for
employees.
someone like me, but now I know I can. Thank you for showing the world what's possible." Julian read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his notebook, the same one that had traveled with him through every stage of this journey. There were other letters, too, one from a young woman in Chicago, another from a teacher in New York. Each one echoed the same simple truth: one man's calm had awakened thousands of others. As he read, Annika stepped into the doorway. "You're still here," she said softly. He smiled without looking up. "Always the last one to leave the hangar." She leaned against the frame. You've done something extraordinary. Julian, but when was the last time you did something for yourself?" He looked up, slightly amused. Rest isn't easy for people who build engines. She crossed her arms, smiling gently. Even engines need maintenance. He laughed quietly. "Point taken."
Welcome to the Zenith
She
Foundation.
hesitated.
We believe in
"There's
elevating the
something I
next
wanted to
generation
tell
of
you.
leaders, and that
The
starts
FAA
with
just
every single
approved
one
your
of you in
Zenith
this room
Equity
today.
Certification Program as a national model. They're going to adopt it across all major carriers." Julian blinked. "All carriers. Yes. Every single one. It's official, you've changed the industry." He leaned back, silent for a moment, absorbing it. Then he said softly, "We did." Annika smiled, then left him to his thoughts. Julian stood and walked to the window again. The lights of the city stretched out like constellations. In the distance, a plane ascended into the twilight, its tail light flickering like a small, determined star. He whispered to himself, "Observation Dharma 11. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what takes off after you." He smiled then, a quiet, content smile, and for the first time in months, he felt weightless. A year had passed since the flight that changed everything. Spring again, softer this time, quieter, as if the world itself had exhaled. Denver International Airport shimmered in morning light. The terminal was unusually calm for a weekday. But at Gate C-12 a small crowd gathered. There was no press, no spectacle, just familiar faces and a single brass plaque newly mounted beside the boarding door. It read, "In honor of Dr. Julian Hayes, for reminding the skies that dignity flies highest." Julian stood nearby, smiling quietly. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a navy sweater, jeans, and his old pilot's watch, the one his father had given him when he earned his first flight certification. Emma approached, holding 2 coffee cups. Black, no sugar, still your preference. Right. He accepted it, nodding with gratitude. "You remembered." She grinned. "Some habits shouldn't change." Then her tone softened. "They wanted to name a terminal after you. You know." Julian chuckled. "A plaque is more than enough. The sky doesn't need my name on a building. It just needs better people flying in it." As passengers began boarding, a group of young students in matching Navy jackets arrived. The first class of Zenith scholars, recipients of the fund he'd created. They were heading to Washington, D.C., for their first aviation leadership conference. Julian watched them with quiet pride. One of the students, a girl no older than 16, recognized him. Her eyes widened. "Dr. Hayes, you're him. You're the reason I applied." Julian knelt slightly so they were eye to eye. "No," he said kindly. "You're the reason I started." She laughed nervously, then hugged him before running to join the others. Behind him, a gentle voice spoke, still inspiring them. "I see." He turned. It was Captain Sarah Mitchell. She looked different, now relaxed, renewed. Her posture had lost its stiffness, replaced with something softer. Julian smiled. "I see the equity program didn't scare you away." She laughed. "Quite the opposite. I just finished mentoring my second group of trainees. They're learning fast and they're learning right." He nodded. "That's good to hear." Sarah hesitated, then handed him a small box wrapped in silver paper. "A token of gratitude. I figured it was time I returned something you gave me perspective." He opened it slowly. Inside was a polished brass compass. On its cover, engraved words shimmered faintly. "To find your way." Remember why you began." Julian's throat tightened. "This is beautiful, Sarah," she smiled softly. "It's not new. It was mine. Once. I carried it during every flight until the day I lost my direction. I think it belongs with someone who knows where he's going." He placed a hand over hers. "We both found our way back. Didn't we?" Her eyes glistened. "Thanks to you." As Sarah left to join the mentoring group, Liam Chen arrived with his camera slung over one shoulder. "Don't tell me you're sneaking out without an interview. Dr. Hayes," he teased. Julian laughed. "I'm done being the story. Liam, it's your turn now." Liam grinned. "Too late. You're trending again." Julian groaned good-naturedly. For what this time, Liam showed him his phone. The clip featured a short video from one of the Zenith scholars boarding the plane, captioned "Flying toward our future because someone once refused to stay grounded." Julian shook his head, smiling. Kids and their poetry. Liam lowered the phone. "You know, you changed how I see journalism. You taught me stories don't have to shout to be heard." Julian looked thoughtful. "And you taught me that truth travels faster than any plane if you give it wings." They exchanged a warm handshake before Liam stepped back, camera ready to capture one last shot of the man who'd quietly redefined leadership. Inside the gate, the boarding call echoed through the terminal. "Zenith Flight 417 to Washington, now boarding all passengers." Julian watched the line of students disappear into the jet bridge. Each carried the logo he'd designed, the silver horizon and golden sky. It filled him with something wordless, something close to peace. Annika appeared at his side, holding a folder. "Before you go," she said softly, "you received another letter." He recognized the handwriting before she even handed it over Mrs. Collins. He opened it carefully. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. "Dear Dr. Hayes, I'm writing from Arizona, where my granddaughter just earned her pilot's license. She watched your hearing last year and said, 'Grandma, I want to fly for someone like him.' I just wanted you to know your calm saved more than that flight. It saved belief. Thank you for reminding an old woman that goodness still flies in formation. Sincerely, Margaret Collins." Julian folded the letter gently, placing it inside his notebook, now filled from front to back with observations and letters, stories and reflections. He turned to Annika. "Remind me to send her flowers." "Already done," she said, smiling. "White lilac's her favorite." He chuckled softly. "You always think ahead." "That's my job," she said, "keeping you grounded while you teach everyone else to fly." They stood together for a long moment, watching the runway where another plane lifted gracefully into the clear blue sky. Julian finally whispered, "You know, I think this is my last flight." Annika looked at him with soft surprise. "Retirement?" He nodded slowly. "Not from purpose, just from noise. Maybe it's time to write, to mentor, to breathe." She smiled. "You've earned that. Julian." He picked up his old leather briefcase, the one he'd carried for 20 years. It was worn at the edges, but familiar, like an old friend. As he walked toward the boarding gate for his flight, not as a CEO, not as a symbol, but as a man, he looked back one last time at the plaque beside the door. The sunlight hit it perfectly, making the words glow. He thought of every person who had walked beside him on this journey. Sarah, Emma, Liam, Elena, Annika, Mrs. Collins, and whispered to himself, "Observation Astros 12. You don't change the world by taking off first. You change it by making sure everyone else can rise too." Then he handed his boarding pass to the attendant, smiled, and stepped onto the plane. The doors closed. The engines hummed to life. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, the sun broke through the clouds golden and endless, just like the future he had helped create. And somewhere, among the sound of wind and altitude, it felt as though the sky itself whispered back, "Thank you for teaching us how to fly." Life will always test the strength of your character more than the size of your power. Dr. Julian Hayes reminded us that dignity isn't proven through shouting or revenge. It's revealed in how we respond to unfairness. When faced with prejudice, he chose calm over chaos, truth over ego, and compassion over pride. The story teaches us that respect cannot be demanded. It must be lived. Real leadership doesn't punish. It transforms. Whether you're running a business, raising a family, or simply walking through a world that sometimes forgets kindness, your quiet integrity can change more than your anger ever could. We often forget justice isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about awakening hearts one moment, one gesture, one choice at a time. For every viewer, especially those who have lived long enough to see both cruelty and change, this story is a reminder that grace remains the most powerful form of strength. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If Dr. Hayes' story touched your heart, if it made you think, reflect, or even believe a little more in the goodness still left in people, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that humanity still matters. Until next time, stay kind, stay thoughtful, and keep believing that every small act of dignity can change the world.